I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I trust. I'm running out of time, 'cause I can see the sun light up the sky. So I hit the road in overdrive, maybe. Oh, this city's cold and empty. No one's around to judge me. I can see clearly when you're gone. Oh, oh. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I trust. Hey, hey, I'm just coming back to let you know. You never say it on the phone. We'll never let you go this time. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm blinded by the lights. No, I can't sleep until I feel your touch. I said, ooh, I'm drowning in the night. Oh, when I'm like this, you're the one I trust.
Jennifer, que inicie Harumi nada más. No hay problema, que inicie Harumi, ya está conectada. Voy a ver su tema de intérprete.
Took a pill and it easy. To show a VG I was cool. When I finally got sober, felt 10 years older, but fuck it, it was
Harumi todavía no la ponen como intérprete. Ahorita voy a ver ese tema para que la ponga.
I'm a real big baller 'cause I made $1 million and I spent it on girls too. But you don't wanna be high like me, never really know why like me. You don't ever wanna step off that roller coaster and be all alone. You don't wanna ride a bus like this, never know who to trust like this. You don't wanna be stuck up on that stage scene, stuck up on that stage scene. All I know are sad songs, sad songs. Darling, all I know are sad songs, sad songs. I know sad songs. I know sad songs. The sir who already blew his shot. I get along with the old timers 'cause my name's a reminder of a pop song people forgot. And I can't keep it calm, no, 'cause as soon as the sun comes up, I cut them all loose and work's my excuse. But the truth is I can't open up. Now you don't wanna be high like me, never really know why like me. You don't ever wanna step off that roller coaster and be all alone. You don't wanna ride a bus like this, never know who to trust like this. You don't wanna be stuck up on that stage scene, stuck up on that stage scene. All I know are sad songs, sad songs. Darling, all I know are sad songs, sad songs.
Look at what you've done. Stand still, falling away from me. When it takes so long, fire's out, what do you want to be? No holding on. Myself was never enough for me. Gotta be so strong. There's a power in what you do. Know every other day I'll be watching you. Oh, oh, I'll show you what it feels like. Now I'm on the outside. Oh, we did everything right. Now I'm on the outside. Oh, I'll show you what it feels like. Now I'm on the outside. Oh, we did everything right. Now I'm on the outside. So you give me no reason for me to stay close to you. Tell me what love is to. How are we still breathing? choose. I'll be the strength in you. No holding on. My self-worth's never enough for me. Gotta be so strong. There's a power in what you do. Now every other day I'll be watching you. Oh, oh. I'll show you what it feels like. Now I'm on the outside. Oh, we did everything right. Now I'm on the outside. Oh, I'll show you what it feels like. Now I'm on the outside. Oh, we did everything right. Now I'm on the outside. Chill out, what you yelling for? Lay back, it's all been done before. And if you could only let it be, you'd see somebody else, won't everyone else watching your back like you can't relax. You try to be cool, you look like a fool to me. Tell me why'd it have to go and make things so complicated. I see the
Buen día con todos los presentes. Soy Torres Román del Directorio Académico 2022 de la carrera Arquitectura y Urbanismo Ambiental en la Universidad Científica del Sur. Continuando con los webinars que se desarrollan dentro del marco de la segunda Semana Internacional de Bioarquitectura, que es un evento anual de la carrera Arquitectura y Urbanismo Ambiental, en la que se desarrollan eventos con profesionales y especialistas de 7 países para impulsar aún más el enfoque sostenible de la carrera. Hoy quisiera dar la bienvenida al arquitecto Michael Pawlyn, quien será nuestro ponente sobre en esta oportunidad y nos hablará sobre el diseño con la naturaleza. Para iniciar, le cedo la palabra al decano, el arquitecto Andrés Neri Figueiredo, para que pueda brindar algunas palabras de bienvenida.
Gracias, Edu. Buenos días con todos. Ya estamos empezando nuestro cuarto día. Hi, Michael. We're going to speak in Spanish, and you have the translation. Es un gran placer empezar esa cuarta jornada el día de hoy con una presencia muy especial de Michael. Michael, yo lo conozco desde que he comprado su libro. No sé si consiguen ver acá. Es un libro súper especial que le digo a todos que si tienen la oportunidad de comprar. Ya lo hice la solicitud para la universidad. A ver acá, aquí se puede ver mejor. Este libro, es el libro de Michael, que imagino va a comentar en un ratito, y que va de encuentro a lo que estamos discutiendo durante toda la semana, como la sostenibilidad, cómo estrategias aplicadas a la arquitectura pueden mejorar nuestro ambiente, nuestra ciudad y nuestra manera de vivir, ¿no? Ayer y anteayer tuvimos charlas que tocaban temas de paisajismo, temas de certificación de edificios, ¿no? Temas de aplicación del arte a la arquitectura. Y hoy creo que con la presencia de Michael, ¿no? Empezamos y reforzamos esa mirada y ese enfoque que queremos que cada uno de ustedes, como estudiantes de la carrera, puedan reflejar en su formación y en su trabajo luego profesional. Gracias, Michael, por la presencia. Gracias más una vez a ustedes y bienvenidos todos.
Para conocer un poco más de nuestro ponente, Michael Pawlyn es un arquitecto de vanguardia pionero en el campo de la biométrica, el uso de mecanismos que se encuentran en la naturaleza para inspirar edificios sostenibles. Se recibió como arquitecto por The Berkeley, Universidad de College de Londres y la Universidad de Bath. Fundó Exploration Architecture en 2007 para centrarse en el diseño de edificios y soluciones de alto rendimiento para la economía circular. Antes de establecer Exploration, trabajó con Greenshaw durante 10 años y fue fundamental para el equipo que diseñó el proyecto Eden. Regularmente es contratado como orador principal sobre innovación y en 2011 se convirtió en uno de los pocos arquitectos que publicaron una charla en TED.com. Inició conjuntamente el proyecto de Bosque del Sahara, cuya última versión fue inaugurada por el rey de Jordania en 2017. En 2019 coinició Los arquitectos declaran una emergencia climática y de biodiversidad, que se ha extendido internacionalmente con más de 7.000 empresas firmadas para abordar la crisis planetaria. Desde el 2018 ha brindado cada vez más asesoramientos a gobiernos nacionales y grandes empresas sobre cambios transformadores. Su libro Biométrica en Arquitectura ha sido el último más vendido por Riva Publication. Su último libro, titulado Florecer, Paradigmas de Diseño para Nuestra Emergencia Planetaria, en coautoría con Sara Ichioka, fue publicado por BIOARQ Press en diciembre de 2021. Bueno, sin más que decir, arquitecto, bienvenido y le cedo la palabra para que pueda iniciar.
Would you like me to start now?
Yeah, please. Now.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. Can you all see the screen okay? Yes, could someone give me a thumbs up?
Very,
Or...
yeah. Thank
great,
you.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about biomimicry, and particularly about biomimicry within a new paradigm of regenerative design. And I will explain the difference between sustainable design and regenerative design shortly. And I'm going to also explain why I think it's very urgent that we make this shift from sustainable to regenerative. And before I start with the main content, I want to get a sense of deep time. And I think one of the best ways to understand deep time is if you were to think of the history of planet Earth as if it was represented by a single calendar year, then, incidentally, this image we're looking at, sorry, let me start again. This image we're looking at, this is an image of planet Earth taken by the Cassini spacecraft as it was passing Jupiter. And it's often said that the first photograph of the Earth taken from the moon was what started the environmental movement back in the 1960s and 70s. And I find this image much more interesting in many ways, because it shows just how isolated we are. It's just that single pale blue dot in this vast expanse of space. And it's clear that no one is coming to our rescue. You know, it's entirely up to us. And this also makes me think of ideas of deep time. So if we were to think of the Earth's history as if it were represented as a calendar year, and then imagine that you're just a breath before midnight on New Year's Eve, and you're looking back over that year, then what you would find is that the first life forms didn't appear until March. The dinosaurs emerged in early December, and they disappeared the day after Christmas. The first hominids appeared at about 8 p.m. today, the 31st of December. The whole of recorded history has flashed past in the last 30 seconds. In the last 1/3 of a second, that's the time I've been alive, we've extinguished more than 2/3 of the non-human animal biomass on planet Earth. So it would be easy to conclude that we are racing towards extinction. And if we carry on as we are, then we are in deep trouble as a species. But in that same very short time frame, that last 50 years, or a third of a second in this representation, in that last third of a second, we have mastered solar energy, we have unparalleled scientific knowledge. And if we now look forward, what we do in the next 1/10 of a second will determine to a large extent the future of humanity. Now, by the way, please feel free to interrupt me if I say something that is not clear. I am very happy to explain things, so there's no problem at all. Now, I had a bit of a turning point in my career in 2018. I had been working on nature-inspired projects with my own office for about 11 years, and we'd managed to produce some, I think, very good ideas, and quite a lot of those did not get built. And the main reason I was given when things didn't get built was these ideas are great, but the market is not ready for them yet. So on this date, on the 5th of October 2018, is when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued their report. And that report showed that if we carry on as we are, we face an absolutely catastrophic future. And this was from the best scientists in the world. And so I reflected and I thought, well, this is just crazy. You know, how is it that I can be told the market is not ready for a lot of my projects, and yet the best scientists in the world tell us that we are hurtling towards a catastrophe? So I embarked on 2 new collaborations. I decided to start writing a book with Sarah Ichioka. Together, we decided that 30 years of sustainable design had not got us anywhere near to where we need to be. And we need to shift to a whole new paradigm. And by paradigm, what I mean is an idea that is broadly held across society, which shapes to a large extent how we behave at a societal level. And it seemed clear to us that we need to shift from a paradigm of sustainable design to a new paradigm of regenerative design. The second collaboration that I started was Architects Declare a Climate and Biodiversity Emergency. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that at the end. Now, sometimes cultural commentators like to point to very specific moments in time when significant changes happened. And some people point to this moment on the 16th of July, 1945. And they say,
just one moment. Yes, okay.
Okay, thank you very much. So some people point to this and say this was the moment that the Anthropocene started. So the Anthropocene, that is the idea that this is a new geological era in which humans became a really significant force, shaping the whole climate and the radioactive cloud, which spread around the world from this explosion that will be detectable in the Earth's geology for the rest of planet Earth's history. So this is another really key moment in history, and this will be familiar to quite a lot of architects. So this was the 6th.
Okay.
Okay, so this was another really key moment in history, the 16th of March, 1972, when the Pruitt-Igoe housing blocks were demolished. The architectural critic, Charles Jenks, declared that this was the day that modernism came to an end and postmodernism began. My laptop seems to have frozen. Ah, okay, that's fine. All right, so in our book, Sarah and I argued that the 10th of October 2018 was also a really significant moment. That was the day that this project in London, the new Bloomberg headquarters by Foster and Partners, won the highest architectural prize in the UK. It's called the Sterling Prize. And this was just 5 days after the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it was claimed that this was the greenest office building ever designed. It scored the highest BREEAM rating ever. BREEAM is like a rating system that we use for buildings here in the UK. And yet, by the architect's own admission, if all new buildings were built to this standard, this would result in a 3 degrees C temperature rise, which would be more than enough to submerge a lot of low-lying nations and low-lying land, and more than enough to make large parts of the tropics completely uninhabitable. And yet this was a building designed by one of the best architects in the world with a very wealthy philanthropic client. It had a huge budget. It was claimed to be the most sustainable office building ever, and yet it was nowhere near what was required. So Sarah and I have argued that this marks the end of sustainability as a paradigm. And one of our heroes really in the book, and very significant for us in Architects Declare, is Donella Meadows. So Donella Meadows was a systems thinker, and in this essay, Leverage Points, she argued that the best way to change a system is by intervening at the level of the paradigm. So she draws up a list of places to intervene in a system and shows that very often we try to change things by intervening in the wrong place. The most influential place is at the level of the paradigm or mindset that really drives how the system behaves. So now I'll explain the difference between sustainable and regenerative. This is a diagram from Bill Reed of the Regenesis Group, and it shows different levels of environmentally responsible design. The most basic level is conventional practice. The next level you could call green design. It's the realm of relative improvement. And then above that is fully sustainable, or as Bill McDonough calls it, 100% less bad. And the problem is that nearly all of what we've been doing over the last 30 years has been below that line of neutrality. And that means it's just part of a degenerative cycle. And it was quite painful for me to accept this, because I've been working in sustainability for about 30 years. And I thought most of that time I was actually making things better. And this diagram made me realize that a lot of what I'd been doing was just making things slightly less bad. So somehow we have to get above that line of neutrality into the realm of actually having a net positive impact. And just as we had lively debates 10, 15, 20 years ago about what the ultimate in sustainability would mean, I think now we need an equally lively debate about what the ultimate in regenerative design would be. And I'm convinced that Bill Reed is right, and that it's getting to the point where humans are participating as nature and co-evolving as part of the whole system. And it's important to remember that a lot of the mistakes we've made are really mistakes that have been made by wealthy industrialized countries over the last couple of hundred years. And many indigenous peoples evolved regenerative ways of building long before the modern era. And some of these demonstrate absolutely wonderful ingenuity. So these are the buildings created by the Madan Arabs who live in what is now Iraq. And they lived in marshlands where the only building material was long blades of grass, really. And they found a way to create these incredibly beautiful structures by turning that weak material into something with a distinctive architectural language. So I think we will need to draw on a number of sources of inspiration. We need to learn from the human ingenuity that existed prior to the fossil fuel age. And I think we'll also need to learn from nature itself. And as you've heard in the introduction, one of the subjects I'm very interested in is biomimicry. So taking design inspiration from nature. And this is quite an amusing example of what we can learn from nature. This is an organism called the dog vomit slime mold. And slime molds are single-celled organisms which form minimum distance networks between sources of food. And in 2009, some scientists at Hokkaido University in Japan carried out an experiment with a map of the Tokyo region. So they put a little source of food on each of the cities surrounding Tokyo. Those are the white dots. And then they put a slime mold on Tokyo itself. The slime mold spread out quite quickly. It located all those sources of food, the cities, and then it started optimizing the connections between them. When it had finished, that layout exactly matched the railway network in that part of Japan. But whereas it had taken the engineers thousands of hours to arrive at that optimization, the slime mold did it in just 26 hours. So that shows that if we can learn from biology, we could learn to solve problems with much greater efficiency. And one of the earliest examples of biomimicry would be shells, bird shells and seashells. And so we know from architectural history that the dome over the cathedral in Florence, the Duomo, the architect for that, Filippo Brunelleschi, he studied bird shells and seashells to help him design the largest and thinnest dome ever created. But what we have now is the huge advantage of superior scientific knowledge. So if you look at one of those shells under a powerful microscope, it looks like this. It's made of these layers, these very thin layers of calcium carbonate. And those are connected together with a flexible protein. And that gives it amazing strength. At a chemical level, it's almost identical to ordinary blackboard chalk, but because of this microstructure, it achieves 3,000 times the strength. And that shows just how much we could increase the efficiency of our buildings if we were to learn from biology. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to describe what I think is meant by regenerative design, starting with regenerative landscapes, then looking at regenerative cities, regenerative buildings, and finally, regenerative materials. So starting with regenerative landscapes, I'm going to tell you about a project that I jointly initiated some time ago. It's called the Sahara Forest Project. What we were trying to do with this project was to address multiple challenges simultaneously. Too often we felt challenges were dealt with individually, whether that challenge is climate change or desertification or providing food in arid parts of the world. And we felt there might be opportunities to use biomimicry and creative integrative thinking to address multiple challenges simultaneously. And it surprised us to learn that a lot of the world's deserts were actually vegetated quite a short time ago. So when Julius Caesar arrived in North Africa, what he found was this wooded landscape of cedar trees and cypress trees. His armies cut those trees down and they created an intensive farm which supplied the Roman Empire with about 500,000 tons of grain every year. But what they started there was a very extractive model of land use. And within 200 years, they had trashed that landscape. So previously, it was quite an abundant landscape with plenty of rainfall. When they'd finished, it was basically a desert. And a lot of the nutrients from the soil had got washed out into the sea. But at the same time, deserts present an amazing opportunity. The intensity of the solar energy that falls on the world's deserts, if we could capture a small amount of that, that would really help us make the shift towards a solar economy where we draw on solar energy in various forms to provide all of our energy needs. And we actually receive about 6,000 times as much energy from the sun every year as we currently use in energy from all forms. And I'm not suggesting it's going to be easy to make that shift, but that statistic of 6,000 to 1 does at least suggest that it's possible. It is a challenge to our ingenuity. So this was an early version, an early visualization of the project. And the key idea was that we were bringing together 3 technologies: forms of solar energy, a type of greenhouse that is cooled and humidified with seawater, and desert revegetation technologies. And when you bring these together, they're actually much more efficient and productive than they would be individually. And one of the most interesting synergies, so what I mean by a synergy is a benefit you get from bringing 2 or more things together. So one of the most interesting synergies was that the shade created by the mirrors made it possible to grow a whole range of crops underneath that would not normally grow in deserts because the intensity of the sun was just too much. We built a version of this and this shows the scheme. We're exploring two types of solar energy. We've got the seawater cooled greenhouse in the middle. To the left of that, we have desert revegetation experiments. At the back, we have salt processing. And then on the right-hand side, we have algae for biofuels. And this was the project on site in Qatar. So this was built during the climate change, or opened during the climate change talks in 2012. And this was it on opening day. It worked extremely well. We managed to grow crops with half the amount of fresh water of conventional approaches throughout the summer months. And alongside trying to optimize the technical aspects of the project, we also monitored what this was doing to the biodiversity. So at the start, it was just a bare patch of desert. There was literally nothing there. And we made a note of any mammals, birds, and insects that appeared on the site. So this little infographic shows what we achieved. So the first things to appear were flies, so nothing particularly interesting there. And then the same day that we brought the first plants to sites, we had the first birds appearing. Very soon after that, we had the first insects, grasshoppers, crickets, and then a month later, we had the first butterflies. And I don't know where these came from, because we were a long way from the nearest patch of significant planting. Then as the plants got more established, we had other types of birds, we had more insects. And then we had a bit of a problem with rats. Their numbers were increasing rather rapidly, but still we were getting more birds and insects. Then we had mice as well, which was a bit of a pain. More birds, more insects. 3 days after the algae ponds were filled, we had the first dragonflies. And again, I don't know where they came from, because this was a long way from the nearest dragonfly habitat. And it shows that nature does have an amazing capacity to regenerate if you can create the right conditions for it. And then we had an appearance from a feral cat, and that was quite good because the number of rats and mice started going down. Still more birds, more insects. We had a rare bird then. This is called a hoopoe. Then other types of birds. That's called a rufous-tailed shrike. Don't try and translate all of these. More birds, more insects, and eventually we had the first indigenous mammal. This is called a jerboa. It's like a little mini kangaroo. It leaves very distinctive tracks. All of that was achieved in just 8 months on a site 100 meters by 100 meters. So I'm convinced that if we were to do this over a longer time scale and on a larger scale, this regenerative effect would be even more pronounced. So now moving on to regenerative cities. The most persuasive model I've heard for how to do this comes from a group in the US. They're called Biomimicry 3.8. And what they suggest is that when you're designing a new piece of city, what you should do at the start is you should analyze how a pristine ecosystem in that part of the world functions. How much carbon does it sequester? How much water does it filter? How much oxygen does it produce? How much food does it produce? How much biodiversity does it accommodate? And all of these should become the metrics that you aim for with your new piece of city. We're nowhere near that at the moment, but there are enough examples of projects that do bits of this for me to be convinced that that is possible. And when we get to that stage, then we could reasonably argue that we have integrated that bit of city into the broader stable ecosystem. And ultimately, the challenge for humanity is to integrate everything we do into the web of life. So I think this means we'll see a lot more buildings with vegetation on. I don't necessarily agree with putting trees on tall buildings, but I think there is a good case for incorporating vegetation, and we need to find a way to do it without using too much carbon intensive material. We need to use more wood as the structure. One of the biggest differences I think you'd see in a regenerative city is in the spaces between buildings. And this is a fantastic scheme from the capital of South Korea, it's Seoul. And this used to be covered by a 6-lane highway. the mayor of the city persuaded people to tear this down. They restored the river and created this amazing linear park, which has become extremely popular. Another important aspect of a regenerative city is to think of it like an ecosystem. So each part of that city is the equivalent of a species in a food web. And what you're trying to do is to connect that all up so that the waste from one part of the system becomes the input for something else in that system. And that moves towards becoming a zero waste, highly productive system. And we explored some of these ideas on the Sahara Forest Project. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit more about the Sahara Forest Project now. This diagram shows the green icons are the key technologies. And then in principle, we were using what we have a lot of, sunlight, seawater, and carbon dioxide, to produce more of what we need: biomass, oxygen, electricity, crops, and materials. And I don't have time to describe all those interconnections, but anything that was underutilized in that system, we use that as an opportunity to add something to create more value. So it was entirely run on solar energy. Seawater was one of the main inputs. Carbon dioxide was absorbed in a number of places, and we were producing all these useful things. Now, sometimes when I show this diagram to people, they think that just looks hellishly complicated. How could we possibly design for this kind of complexity? Well, this is nowhere near as complex as a real ecosystem. And I believe this is the kind of complexity that we need to work with if we're to make progress with regenerative design. And it's getting easier to design for this kind of complexity because we've got digital tools. So this is one that one of my colleagues created. And what this allows you to do is to input a technology with its resource flows. You can connect them up, and then you can press play, and you can see how it works. Anything that is underutilized, that's an opportunity to add something to create more value. You can also use this to test the system. If you cut one of those links and the whole system breaks down, then that's a sign that you need to add more duplication or more buffering or water tanks or batteries and so on to make the system more robust. And this, I believe, is going to help us get much closer to the amazing efficiency that you find in nature, where there is no such thing as waste. It all runs entirely on solar energy, and it's a world of beauty, efficiency, and abundance. Now moving on to regenerative buildings. A while ago, I was asked to lead a team to design an office building using biomimicry. And I brought together a team of some of the best consultants that I've got to know over the last 20, 30 years. And we included a biologist in the design team. And if you're going to be working with biomimicry and regenerative design, I think it's essential to understand more about biology. So working with the team, we decided in the first workshop that daylight was likely to be one of the biggest drivers of the architectural form. So with our biologist in the design team, we looked at ways in which light is gathered and distributed in biology. So what I'm drawing here is the eye of a fish. It's called a spookfish. And it has these mirror structures in its eyes, which are able to focus light coming up from the ocean, very low levels of bioluminescence. Another one we looked at is a plant that lives in deserts. So this is called a stone plant. And for reasons of thermal stabilization, most of the plant lives below the ground. And that means that the chemical reactions can take place at a steady temperature, and then the light comes down through what you could call a roof light down to the basement where the chemical reactions take place. Another one we looked at is a type of starfish. It's called a brittle star. And this has evolved a covering of lenses on its skin. And these lenses are able to detect and focus very small amounts of light and movement so that this can see predators before they see it. These three examples and many others of how light is gathered in nature, these encouraged us to think much more creatively and deliberately about how we would bring light into the office. A fairly normal way of designing for light in offices is to just think about the right distance between the window walls. In London, you can often find very deep offices, 25, 30, sometimes even 40 meters deep. And you know those are going to be very energy intensive because they'll be artificially lit and air conditioned. So what's the right dimension? Well, we reckon it was about 12 meters. So no one is further than 6 meters from the nearest window. And now thinking about the kind of form that this building could have, one approach would be to take those narrow floors and stack them up into a tower. But that would only make sense if we had high land values in a central urban location. And we wanted a more universal idea than that. So we looked at two other building forms, a ring of offices around a central atrium, and then another one that had these two linear blocks with a linear atrium. And it was the last one that seemed to work the best when we analyzed the light levels. So now looking at the building in plan, we used daylight software to analyze the light levels. And we found we're getting this curved pattern of shading because of the shading effect of the opposite blocks. So the next move was to simply bend those floors so we get a very even quality of light all the way along. Now, this produced some further challenges. One is that narrow floors aren't particularly good for creative clusters of people. And also this wasn't making very efficient use of a rectangular site. So then learning further ideas from biology about surface area to volume optimization, we turned the building into this elaborated form. So we still had no point further than 6 meters from the nearest window, but now we were getting better facilities for creative clusters of people, and we were making more efficient use of a rectangular site. So still looking at daylight, but now looking at the building in section, we found it was reasonably easy to get enough light into the top parts of the building. The challenge was how to get the light further down. And we looked at the possibility of harvesting light and focusing it into fiber optic glass tubes to channel it around the building. For this, we looked at a rainforest plant. It's called Anthurium warraquinum, and on its leaves, it has lenses which are able to focus diffuse light. So that's become a research project which we hope to bring back into the next stage of the office building. We concluded that there was a good case for shaping the building, and we proposed a pair of large-scale light reflectors in the middle that would bounce light into those lower floors. And that was inspired by the spookfish. And then thinking about what we would do underneath those mirrors, we thought this was a great opportunity to design a really dramatic meeting space with a wonderful quality of light, and this could be let out for events and it would add value to the building. So most of what I've said about this office building has been about daylight so far. The way we used biomimicry from the structure was to reduce the amount of material as much as possible. So in biology, what you often find is very complicated shapes that achieve amazing resource efficiency by putting the material exactly where it needs to be. What I'm drawing here is a section through a bird skull. And a lot of bird skulls are made of very thin layers of bony material in like dome shapes. And then those are connected together with little struts and ties. And that gives it amazing strength and amazing lightness. And there's a scientist that we work with quite a lot called Julian Vincent, who says that in nature, materials are expensive and shape is cheap. And so you can find a lot of examples of structures that use material very efficiently and use ingenious shape for strength. So this one I'm drawing here, this is the bone in a cuttlefish. So thin layers of bone connected together using a minimum of materials to maximum effect. So what we did then is we analyzed a fairly typical column and slab in an office, and we the bits that I'm shading in dark here, these are the bits that are not doing anything. They're structurally redundant. And what nature would do is really follow the shape that it wants to be. So for instance, the center of the columns, those would probably be hollow because the material there is not doing much. The floors would probably be deeper in the middle where the forces are highest. And then you could have void formers that would take out that excess material. And this is perfectly possible with existing technology. And by using biomimicry as the starting point, we identified the ideal that we were aiming for. Now, if I had more time, I'd love to tell you how we learned from seashells and curved leaf forms to design a new glazing system, which lets in exactly the right amount of light. A new glazing system that uses about half the amount of glass as conventional systems and about a 70% saving in aluminium. We also studied folding beetle wings to help us design a sun shading system that would let in exactly the right amount of light and convert all surplus light to electricity. So this is how the scheme looked when we finished. You can see the form of the building. It's all driven by daylight. In the middle, you've got the spookfish reflectors, the auditorium, and you might just be able to see the curved glazing system based on the curved shells and leaf forms. And this is how the scheme would look in the middle. And when we return to the design of this, we want to incorporate even more planting for the psychological benefits that this would deliver. One of the engineers has predicted that if this gets built, it should be one of the lowest energy office buildings in the world. Now, another example of a regenerative building that I'm going to show you is this one. So this is the zero waste textiles factory that we designed for an Indian client. And here we were exploring the ideas that I talked about previously of learning from ecosystems or biological systems. And if you compare conventional human-made systems with biological systems, what you find is that ours tend to be simple and disconnected, whereas biological systems are complex and interconnected. Ours are linear and wasteful, whereas biology works with closed loop and zero waste. Biology is adapted to constant change. It doesn't use long-term toxins. It runs entirely on current solar energy. It's optimized as a whole system. And very importantly, it's regenerative rather than extractive. So that right-hand list, I think, is a very good summary of where we should be heading with our industries and our cities. So for the textile factory, we thought about this as having three main realms. There's the factory itself with the machinery, there's the water cycle, and then there's the energy cycle. Within the factory, there are lots of different processes, and we studied all of those resource flows so we could find synergies between them, and we could make use of any wasted resources. We converted the fossil fuel system to a biomass system that was providing steam and electricity, and it was making use of all the waste heat from the factory. And then for the water cycle, the main challenge was to design out all the toxic materials that normally go into this system. And for that, we had to work with a biologist, a chemist, and a water expert. And we managed to do it. And that was great because that meant that we could use biological forms of water treatment for all of the water treatment. This is how the scheme would look inside, and it has quite big windows down the edges. And down the middle, that's actually the water treatment system. So it's using plants and microorganisms, and that also gives people something to look at so they can connect with nature, whether they're in the factory or in the staff building in the middle. And this picks up on another important element of regenerative design, which is called biophilia. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that, biophilia is the idea that because we evolved in direct contact with nature, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that we are happier, healthier, and more productive if we're in regular contact with nature. And in some hospitals where this has been used, they've achieved incredible improvements in recovery rates, about an 8% improvement in recovery rates, and patients need about half the amount of pain-relieving drugs. So the final category is regenerative materials. And this organism here, this is called a coccolithophore. So it's a marine microorganism. And prior to humans being around, this was part of the control system that maintained CO2 levels in the atmosphere at steady levels. So when the CO2 levels rose, there would have been huge growths of these microorganisms growing these beautiful skeletons from calcium and carbon, and then that would fall to the ocean floor when they died and build up layers of limestone. And that would transfer carbon from the atmosphere into the rock and helping to maintain the balance. So if you're interested in biomimicry, one thing you could conclude from this is that we should be making much more stuff using atmospheric carbon. And of course, timber is one of those opportunities, but there are other ones as well. And if you look at the closest equivalent to concrete in biology, it would be coral reefs. So coral is a large-scale mineral structure, but there's a big contrast between this and concrete. When we make concrete, it emits large quantities of greenhouse gases. Coral grows by taking carbon out of its immediate environment and turning that into a solid material. There are now a growing number of products that do things similar to this. So this is a building block called biomason, which can be made just by putting sand into a mold and adding a bacterium. And the bacterium produces calcium carbonate, which turns it into a solid block. I think we're also going to see a lot more materials made from biologically derived material. This is actually a high performance insulation made entirely from plant fiber and mycelium. This is a table that we designed for an office, sorry, we designed for an exhibition of our work. And this was 3D printed using a biologically derived polymer. So that carbon would have been in the atmosphere, it was taken out by plants and then turned into a material. And that structure, there's nothing accidental about that. That's actually based on the growth patterns of plants and trees. And it uses a computer software that tries to produce a theoretically perfect structure. And what I mean by that is it's putting all the material in exactly the right place so that you're using a minimum of material. And to conclude now, I just want to say a few things about Architects Declare, which we launched in May 2019. And we then expanded it to Construction Declares, and it's now actually called Built Environment Declares. And so this was launched at a similar time to me starting to write my book. I initiated it with a good friend of mine, Steve Tompkins. And the initial idea was that we would get some of the winners of the UK Sterling Prize. So this was like 15 of the leading practices in the UK to make a joint declaration of climate and biodiversity emergency. And after it launched, we thought we'd have to work very hard to get maybe 50 other practices signed up so that we could then persuade our institution to declare a climate and biodiversity emergency. Actually, we were surprised at the positive response, and we had 200 firms signing up in the first 2 days, and we've now got 1,200 firms in this country, and it's spread to lots of other disciplines, engineers, project managers, landscape architects, and so on. And we also set this up so that it'd be very easy for other people to establish equivalent versions in other countries. And it now exists in 26 countries. And if any of you listening would like to launch it in Peru, we'd be absolutely delighted. The website, builtenvironmentdeclares.com, that shows you how to set up your own. So will this be enough? If we have all the right ideas and we have pressure groups pushing for change, will it be enough? Well, I don't think it will. And that's because I see a lot of this complacency. A lot of people are just carrying on as if we really don't have a problem. And so I actually think it's not enough to just have the solutions and industry support. We're actually going to need large-scale public support. I don't know how safe it is to mount public demonstrations in Peru, but in countries where it is possible to join public protests, I think it's only when we get enough people on the street demanding change that we will have meaningful change. And all the solutions exist. All the solutions exist that would allow us to make rapid progress on the climate and biodiversity crisis. And to finish, I just want to say a few things about this amazing organism. So this is called a glass sponge. It lives in quite deep seawater, and it has evolved to create these absolutely beautiful structures. And these are just made out of local materials of silica and calcium and carbon. And engineers have been studying these for quite some time now, trying to understand how they are so efficient. And the fibers, the vertical fibers that you can see, those go all the way down into the seabed. And those are actually glass fibers with higher optical quality than human-made glass fiber. And at the end of each of those, there's a cluster of lenses. That's the image on the bottom right. And those lenses gather light from bioluminescent bacteria in the seabed. So bacteria that produce light. And it's focused into those lenses, and then it's conducted up the glass fibers, and the organism puts on a kind of lighting display that draws food towards it. And the reason I've shown this is because I think this displays some of the things we need to learn how to do. We need to learn how to make beautifully efficient structures with a fraction of the material. We need to learn how to make our materials with far less energy. This creates high quality glass with perhaps 1/1,000,000th of the energy of our approach to making glass. And this also shows the idea of symbiosis or synergies between different organisms. And importantly, I think this also points to a new relationship with the rest of the living world. And rather than seeing nature as something that can just be plundered for resources, this shows how nature really is a source of wonder and a source of some of the best solutions that will allow us to shape a really positive future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Very, very interesting talk.
Thank you. And I just show you, this was my first book, Biomimicry in Architecture, and then this is the book that came out at the end of last year, which I co-authored with Sarah Ichioka.
Great. Now we're going to open for questions. I'd like to make the first question. I'm a bit interested about your creative process.
Okay.
What's the process to select or search this analogy between flora and fauna with your projects? Is there a previous research work to search for material without a precise objective or goal? Or project is the starting point for the biological research?
Yes. Well, the most methodical way of doing it is to clearly identify the functional challenge that you're trying to solve. And within one project, there might be lots of different functional challenges like ventilation, fire protection, structure, etc.
Okay.
And for each of those, you then need to find how that function has been delivered in biology. You need to understand how that works and then make a translation from biology into design. And that used to be quite difficult, but now it's much easier because there are good online resources. So one of those is called asknature.org. And you can put in a question like, how would nature do X? And it gives you examples of organisms that have solved that problem. There is another way, which is kind of perhaps less methodical, but that's where you just have a very sort of a good radar for interesting ideas. And when you see something amazing in biology, you think, well, I know what I could do with that. I could do X. And so sometimes that might lead to a completely new project idea.
Okay. Okay, very interesting. So, questions, preguntas, chicos?
I'm going to stop sharing so that it's easier for me to see people. If you want to turn your cameras on, you can do.
Por favor, cámaras prendidas, a ver, para que no sea solo yo y Michael. Y quien quiera hacer una pregunta.
If there aren't many questions, perhaps we could talk about the project one of you is working on. What are the kind of problems you're trying to solve at the moment?
In the university.
Yes. If there's a particular student project that some of you are working on now.
Ok. Chicos, si alguien tiene una pregunta exacta, ¿no? Algún problema que tengan de proyecto que quisiera tal vez con la experiencia de Michael para resolver. Han visto todo el trabajo y toda la metodología que hace a partir de la analogía con la biología.
Or another thing we could talk about is what's the current state of the debate about the environment and design and architecture in Peru at the moment? Where do you think things are at the moment?
Well, we are just starting. Maybe we have some laws and some codes about sustainability construction. Now we have Marianne Dixon, our professor from Científica. Do you have any question, Marianne?
No, I'm overwhelmed for this marvelous information you have shared with us.
Thank you very much.
Really overwhelmed. I have to digest everything you said, so we can hopefully we can meet some other time and have some questions regarding what you were asking about our Peruvian situation. Unfortunately, we're very far behind, but at least Científica is one of the few universities that is so much interested in bringing this this fight for our world, no? So it's really it's very emotional that we can teach our students how with architecture we can give this small grain of sand in recovering our world. So I'm really overwhelmed with everything you shared with us. Thank you so much.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you. And what are the main environmental challenges in Peru, would you say? I know that part of the country is very dry, so I guess that's one of them. What are the other big challenges, do you think?
Well, we have various climates. We have the coast is a big desert. We have little water, a lot of sand, no trees, very few trees. And unfortunately, we have big changes in our surface. After the desert, the coast desert is very interesting because we don't have, because we're near the sea, we have not extreme climate changes. Therefore, that is also a problem because people can settle and make small urban, not cities really, anywhere, because you can spend overnight actually with no protection. So therefore, these small little towns grow with very little preparation. There's no extreme climate in the coast. Then we have the desert, which there you have a little contrast. Then we have the mountains or the ranges, the Cordillera, the Los Andes, which also has a different climate altitudes, where we have a lot of altitude. It's very, very cold, a lot of radiation, a lot of radiation and dry during the day, but very, very cold and very humid in the night. And then we have the jungle. So we have a lot to teach our students, because we have to prepare them for all these different climates. No, we have we could more or less concentrate on 3 big climates, but actually we have 9 different climates that we try to prepare them for, no?
Okay, cool. All right, fine. Well, if there are no questions, if someone thinks of a question later, then feel free to email me. Sometimes it takes me a little while to respond to emails, but I will try to respond if there's a particular question.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Let me see. No, we don't have any questions now. Edu? We have one question here.
Okay.
In the project you show in South Korea, you used the methodology of biomimicry in the beginning of your creative process?
Right. That's not one of my projects. I was just showing that as an example of what I think a regenerative city would look like. So in the spaces between buildings, I think we're going to see a lot of public space reclaimed from cars, essentially, and used for vegetation and creating a much more enjoyable environment. And it's taken the UK quite a long time to get to this point, but I'd say 10 years ago, we realized as a country that it's just not a good idea to try and plan for the endless expansion of cars. It actually is very detrimental to our quality of life. And so car ownership has been reducing, and particularly in the cities. In London, car ownership has reduced a lot. And we're starting to reclaim public space for better uses. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. We're seeing a lot of that already in cities like Paris and Amsterdam and so on.
Andrés, si me permites.
Of course.
Michael, that I would like to share with you too. We have a few districts in Lima, at least in Lima, which are now trying to improve the quality of air at the same time, as you mentioned, this kind of quality. We sometimes do not take into account how important it is to see green, no? And now we are starting, because you were asking in which level we were. Now buildings are starting to put green in our roofs. Because of our situation, we are in between tropics, much different to your climate. We have sun mostly on top of our heads, no? Sometimes north, sometimes south. That is sometimes a little bit difficult to the design, because we have sun on both facades, whereas you always have sun on the south facade. No, it is a challenge. It is a challenge to design. Sometimes it is something positive. Sometimes having sun on both north and south, it makes it a little bit more complicated. But the point is that at least we're starting to put green in our roofs, because we, as I was saying, Lima is on a desert. If you could see our roofs, they're all junk, actually, because they're not used. And thank God, gradually this is starting to change, but it's a slow process. We have a lot of problems with our governments, as you must know. But gradually we are starting to put green in our roofs, and that is also so important. I enjoy very much your pictures you were sharing with us about how important it is. And in your country, this is something you studied for a long time, because I remember hearing how important it was. You have very little sun, you have little exposure to sun, so your conditions as health conditions and emotional conditions are very hard. And you've managed to, with these changes, improve the quality of life, which is something that usually we don't value, no? And it is so important. So it was fascinating to see that you, as a country, are taking this so much as a consideration. And I hope we sometime soon are on that way. Thank you.
Great.
Well, we have another question, Michael,
Yes.
from Dana Ladera. Do you think there's a possibility that Peru uses this type of technology in a near future?
Yes, I think there's every possibility.
We need a good biologist, maybe.
Yes, and
or a good team.
you know, a really important question, wherever you're designing, an important question to ask at the beginning is, what solutions already exist in this place? And I'm referring there to solutions from centuries of human ingenuity and solutions in the form of biological adaptations. And so, for instance, in deserts, you can often find some of the best adaptations to water shortages. You find plants that suck water out of the air, beetles that can gather water on their backs, lizards that drink with their feet, and so on. And so if you want to apply these ideas in Peru, then yes, you're right, Andre. You do need a good biologist and get to know and understand a bit more about the biology of your local area.
Great.
Cool. Okay, well, I'd better go really, because I've got some other things coming up quite soon. But a real pleasure meeting you. Thanks for involving me. If there are further questions, then you can certainly email them to me, and I'll try and get around to answering them.
It's our pleasure to have you here. And bye-bye. See you next time.
Great. Okay, thank you. Bye now.
Gracias, chicos.